Good morning.
Right, good morning, everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining us today. This is the first in a series of workshops where we're going to be focusing on family collections and family archiving. I'm Imogen. I'm a research fellow and Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in the Centre for Arts, Memory and Community at Coventry University. And I was kind of inspired to bring this together really by a project that I've been working on early modern family archives. And the aim of the series is to explore some of the challenges and the opportunities that working with or on family collections and family archives can present. The aim, although my own work is early modern, is not for it to be temporally or geographically specific, and hopefully also to be quite an interdisciplinary kind of discussion. So for our next event, for example, we have an artist, Professor Jill Journeau, who'll be coming to talk about her work, which is research but also practice based. I think she's currently doing an art project on objects as archives, particularly on using old family tea sets. So we've got lots of different perspectives hopefully coming into this discussion, and I hope that they're going to open up a forum to kind of discuss and share materials and ideas and maybe forge some new collaborations, and also lead into more events and conferences on family archives going forward. So for each workshop, we found some speakers who very generously agreed to come and talk to us and to reflect on the theme of each workshop in their own work, leaving plenty of time for kind of questions and discussions afterwards. And today we're lucky to have two historians with us who are experts on archives and on the family, Dr. Katie Barclay and Dr. Lisbeth Correns. Before I introduce them formally, I'm just going to quickly hand you over to Kausa Hussain, who's our research support officer and who's just going to quickly chat through some of the housekeeping stuff about Zoom, etc.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thanks, Imogen, for welcoming everyone. Thank you for joining us on Zoom. We have the chat available if you have any questions, comments. If you'd like to share your contact details with other people in this workshop, then please feel free to do so. When it comes to the question and answers section towards the end of the presentation, you can either ask it via the chat or you can raise your virtual hand. Feel free to turn your mic on if you want to ask your question to the speakers directly, and unmute yourself. But for the duration of the workshop, if everybody could please keep themselves muted if they're not speaking, then that would be greatly appreciated, just to minimize the noise levels. And yeah, if you've got any questions, then you can message me directly as well. But I think that's it. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Zoom etiquette by now. But yeah, if you do have any questions, any technical issues, please contact me. If you've got any questions for the speakers or anyone else, then please use the chat. Thank you.
Fab, thank you, Kausa. And thank you to Kausa for helping to set all of the tech for these up. It's really appreciated. So talking to us first then, I think we agreed we're going to go alphabetical. So we shall be hearing from Dr. Katie Barclay, who's an associate professor at the University of Adelaide, where she's also deputy director of the Centre of Excellence in the History of Emotions. She's published numerous books and articles, and she's currently working on a project entitled Governing Emotions, the Effective Family and the Law During the Long 18th Century. So Katie, I'm going to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for having me. This is kind of a fun sort of conversation for me to have, because I've been an early modernist for quite a lot of my career, so I'm very familiar with using family archives to kind of, to go in and select little parts of to tell other kinds of stories. And then recently my work has actually been around family historians and their archives, and they are often people who are alive. That's quite exciting all by itself. But they are people who might not have curated their archives in the way that a professional archivist would, and what they hold can be a lot more idiosyncratic and often a lot smaller. And I think that's a theme, I guess, that I want to kind of bring out today is thinking about the big archive versus the small one. So I thought I'd start off by making maybe the obvious point, but I think that really quite a lot of archives are family archives, even when that's not necessarily apparent. Now, if you are interested in early modern people, you will often have went into an archive that was held by a family, often an elite family, and they often, that might be their books and papers, it could be their private letters, it could be their diaries, but so we kind of think of that as a family archive, but often things like petitions and legal papers and account books and even business records have started off as part of family heritages, and they've been held by a family till at some point they have moved into like a professional archive where we can then access it. And I thought one of the interesting things that I have been thinking about is, well, what difference does it make that the archives, or so many of the archives that we use, used to belong to families, and what exists in them, and how they were curated and what survived were the decisions made by families. And so when we think about some of the kind of early modern archives that I've been certainly using, some of them are very big. And the one that I'm using at the moment, which is about the Innes of Stowe papers, which are held at the National Records of Scotland. George Innes in particular was known to be a hoarder. And so there's a lot of comments all the way through the catalogue of his archive about the fact that he just has so much stuff. At one point, he finds a piece of paper on the street which has a shopping list on it, and he keeps it and he writes on it found, and he writes the address of where he found it and picked it up, and he keeps it in his archive, and it survives, 300 years later. We still have a shopping list that a man picked up on the street. And I feel like the archivist who tells the story of that archive really wants to emphasize the size and scale, like just how much stuff is there, and the sense then of completeness around it. And one of the things I have been grappling with is whether it really is complete. And I think that that's not true. And so then there's this kind of interesting question about, well, what survives for when and why, and what got binned and how did it get there? And sometimes I think that if you work with an archive that has a lot of scale, but which also has a lot of ephemera and rubbish in it, basically things that you seem like receipts or scraps of paper or notes, you kind of think, oh, this is somebody who's just kept every bit of paper. But then you realize it's maybe only for 3 months, or it's only for a year. And then for the rest of their life, they have been much more organized about the material. There's a whole lot of kind of other kinds of questions about, what got kept and at what point did it get kept, and what hasn't made it into the archive, that starts you to kind of think about these things. And I think family historians, if you like, I'm writing about a biography of Gilbert Innes of Stowe, so I've had to think about the scope and scale of the archive in a way that I don't think I have on previous projects. So my first book on marriage, for example, I just went and looked at people's letters. I picked a bunch of people, I read their letters. Sometimes those letters lasted for 3 months, sometimes they went over several years. You just kind of access that point in the family archive. And now I've got to go, well, what does it mean to create a life out of all of their stuff? And it's not all of it, right? It's what survives, but it seems a lot, and it's, and in some ways it can feel kind of comprehensive, and then that starts to kind of, I think, delude you into thinking you know everything. But then you've got to really kind of grapple with, well, what can I read? I only have one life. He has 400 account books. There's only so much you can actually do with the archive to create a story, and how do you manage that? And I think you can put this against these kind of small archives held by for individuals, and particularly what I'd say ordinary people who don't have big houses. And I think the big house thing might be part of this story. Because when we talk to family historians today and you ask them, what do they keep, what do they treasure, they don't tend to have rooms and rooms of papers, or huge amounts of treasures. Every generation they've had to cull, basically, and often I suspect that is as much about practical space as it has been about your emotions towards those objects, that you cannot take the entirety of your grandmother's house and keep it in your own house. And so instead you go through and you try to pick those valuable objects, and perhaps then you pass them to your children, and it gets finned again and it gets finned again. And so there's some really interesting questions there, I think, about those stages of kind of removal and extraction from the archive, and what gets kept, and the emotions involved in that. And in the work that I've been kind of thinking about at the moment, I'm really interested in this idea of intergenerational emotions, as a way of thinking about the family archive. So to think about how we imagine our relationship with our ancestors, and all the emotional investments we have in those imagine people, often people you've never met, but those kind of stories about who you are and where you came from, as part of that process of decision making about what you choose to keep and hold as an inheritance, and what chooses to go in the bin or to be hid in the attic, because you feel an obligation to keep it, but it's quite ugly, so it's kind of going to sit there, and to think through about, I guess, those emotional processes that aren't just about your feelings about an object, but are really about your feeling with those overlapping generations. And I think an interesting question for me is about how do we take those insights about intergenerational emotions and about people's relationships with their families and think about that in terms of these really big archives that are then held professionally. I mean, partly because we then recognise that they will have been curated by professional archivists at some point, and often at that point there'll have been a culling of the record, and a kind of curating of the story of the archive, that was beyond and outside of the family, and that's kind of different from those that remain in the family. But I think there's also that sense of which you kind of have to go, well, what survives, even if it's a lot of stuff, has at some point been somebody's choice, and we can think through, well, why did Gilbert, who was George's son, the obsessive hoarder, think that he wanted to keep all of his dad's bits of papers, including shopping lists that he found in the street? Like, what went into that decision? And his dad died a long time before him, like 30 odd years. It wasn't like you could say it was a kind of fate that they died in the same week. I mean, clearly he chose to keep it, and he probably was able to keep it because he had a landed house, and so there was a kind of that sense of space where you can just keep all of those records and you don't have to worry about it. And we all know that familiar story about elite families and their use of the archive to curate that their sense of identity and importance. And for the Inneses, they were a merchant family, especially in George's parents' generation. They were merchants who went into banking, made a fortune. So these are very rapidly upwardly mobile. It was George who bought the landed estate. So I think these are the kinds of families where we would expect them to want to keep their records as part of that kind of curation of elite identity, of that sense that we're important and our story matters, and we're going to hold of all the bits of paper. So I can kind of see why Gilbert might not have wanted to go through it all and put it in the bin. But he also perhaps didn't filter it either. And if it's about the curation of identity, then you might think to yourself, well, a lot of people do weed their papers. They do think quite carefully about what should survive and what shouldn't survive. And I do think that there is more curation in that archive than it first appears, but I do think it's a bit uneven, and so that's an interesting process as well about but where the work got done and when did it get stopped, and how does that tell us something about these families. So I don't really have a lot of conclusions here about what the right answer is. I guess the question that we kind of posed today was to think about, well, how do you approach an archive and create stories out of it when you've kind of got all these kind of questions about what it is and what makes it. And I think that for me, the interesting questions tend to are to be thinking through those processes of like very conscious curation, those processes of professional curation, but also those emotional kind of instincts and those kind of ways that our understanding and relationship to our ancestors is kind of informing those choices and the decisions that we're making around these things. So there's not a kind of very nice and neat solution, and probably it's going to differ a lot depending on the family we're talking about. And there are also some real material issues here. The size of your house probably does matter quite a lot to what you get to keep. But I kind of think that it kind of starts to open up some really interesting questions about, well, what is this archive that we use, and how do we think about archives as belonging to the family? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Katie. That's fascinating. I have absolutely masses of questions that I've just noted down, but I'm going to keep hold of them until we've heard from our next speaker, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the same themes in her own work, Dr. Lisbeth Correns, who's a lecturer in history at Queen Mary University of London, where she specialises in travel, mobility, archives, and the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And her first book, published in 2019, was called Confessional Mobility and English Catholics in Counter-Reformation Europe. So I'm going to hand over to you, Lisbeth, and I think you had some slides that you were going to share with us.
Can you see those slides now?
We can, yes, thank you.
Excellent, perfect. So yeah, thank you so much for to Katie already for a wonderful paper with lots of thoughts going around, and for inviting me to be part of this. This is a great series of events to think through these things. And I think what Katie was saying as well, in the kind of there's so much there, and it is so much intersecting problems and issues and interests that having that longer conversation will be great. So as Imogen said, like, I work on Catholic archives and Catholic histories. I thought for today I would focus on, if I manage to actually move on slides, yes, on one particular family archive that, so the way that I got into thinking about archives was through my first book about mobility and exile, where it was really hard to find actual records of their time abroad, because I wanted to look at actual individuals and laity, and not just at the religious orders, but all the records that I could find that were definitely mapping exile or mobility were only about the religious. And so I ended up having to go into lots of family archives where you do see those traces. They're not archives of mobility, but you see the traces of the mobility within that. And that got me really interested in just how much intersecting issues there are in these family archives that you can call family archives, that you can't necessarily call a Catholic archive, even when they are the archives of Catholics. And so thinking through, like, what is it that they're trying to compile, and why, has become, in between the teaching and the marking, a great way of keeping my brain organized. And so thinking this family, the Constable family, is also, their archive is dispersed. This is a volume that is in Hull. There is in the Hull History Centre, and other materials are in the East Riding Record Office, and I'll bring one of those up as well. So they are everything that you expect from any kind of early modern family archive. So you've got lots of letters, you've got lots of small digestions of biographies, you've got lists of baptisms, any kind of document that you think of that you've seen in a family archive, it is there. But what is also interesting is that you've got these kind of, this is a travel pass, you've got the oaths of allegiance, you've got petitions, you've got prison charges. That is also interlaced within these collections. And I mean, this one is even part of just a selection where they are piecing together just all kind of documents around the penal laws. And so this seems to be the kind of, this is how these penal laws, these national laws, are both impacting on the family itself, so on a very local level, on their family level, and the traces of that. But what intrigues me as well is that these are not just a reflection of, oh, this is what happened, but these are oaths, and these are passes, and these are petitions. They're all the kind of documents that are trying to restore that relation with their monarch. If we want to go fully technical with John Austen, the kind of the speech acts where these are establishing those relationships and are making these Catholics who are the ones supposedly the enemy to the state, are making them very much part of the state mechanisms. And so this is really central to this kind of collection. And so I'm very curious just how much this is inscribing this family within that relation to the monarch as members of the community of their subjects, in much the same way that baptism records are actively inscribing a family in or those individuals in the community of Christians. So thinking about, like, what these documents, they're doing more than just any kind of abstract reflection. So that's one thing, that kind of the question of the speech acts, but also within that, and again, making these kind of collections very active and not just in the way that journalists like to write about the dusty archives. These are archives that are really used and that carry meaning in and of themselves. They bring that to life with all kinds of humans as well. These archives are, or these family archives are, as was said earlier as well, like it is so much about the materiality of the house or the physical space of the house as well. These are preserved at that point in their house, and people visit, and people know that there is knowledge beyond the written word in these kind of collections. So Cuthbert Constable is an antiquary who's very active, and we've got really interesting letters going back and forth across England, not just with Catholics. For instance, there's a long conversation with Thomas Hearn, who's the antiquary in Oxford, who is trying to make sense of pre-Reformation England, but is really reliant on lots of Catholics to do so, and deliberately seeking out Catholics, deliberately seeking them out for their connection to religious houses, because Cuthbert Constable puts him in touch with some of his family members who are Benedictines, who are Franciscans, with the explicit note, like they can help you understand these Franciscan documents, these Benedictine documents, because they're still part of the tradition. And so thinking through what like Elizabeth Yale has called sociable knowledge, like this is through that conversation, through that knowledge embodied in these humans that are tangentially related to these houses where these collections are kept. So that's what I wanted to say about that collection itself. The kind of that question of the Speech Act, like these are very active documents, and then the very human nature that is part of these collections as well. But this is still like a very complex or amalgamous set of sources, and figuring out that the same questions that Katie was asking, like what is the purposefulness behind this, how are choices being made, is very seldom spelled out. But you see a lot of people active in preserving this material and constantly engaging with it. So you've got a number of hands annotating lots of these letters. You've got, I mean, the fact that those penal laws that this book, that was bound in the 18th century with lots of documents from the 16th and 17th century. That is an intervention in and of itself. But then you've got this letter, which is a letter by Thomas Horncastle, which starts with, "The favor I have received from you in transcribing Mr. Knaresborough's works." And that's a letter to Cuthbert Constable, and asking for more work, more writing and transcribing work. And that is really interesting because Knaresborough is this guy, and he is a secular priest who really, in the same way, talking about the houses where these collections are, he spent a lot of time in the houses of Charles Townsley and Cuthbert Constable, using their collections. And what he's doing with that is creating, as you see on the title, The Suffering of Catholics, which are multi-volume books. Actually, each book is for a reign. So you've got Elizabeth, you've got James I, you've got Charles the First, Charles II, James II. So he's really telling, and as the title says, the suffering of Catholics. This is the hardship of Catholics that are going through in this Protestant nation. And within that you find all the again, all the usual suspects. There is a lot of focus on martyrdom, and you see that in other collections as well. But what is interesting in his collection is how much time he makes, or space he keeps, for the gentry. So lots of the English Catholic compilations are about those religious, are about the martyrs, the priests who are being killed at the stake. He puts a lot of time in talking about the sequestrations during the civil wars, which recently Ilish Gregory has written an amazing book about, which is really not something that has been paid a lot of attention to. When you tell the story of English Catholics, it's the story of martyrs, partly because of those other big collections. And that is the image of the English Catholic. But he is creating a different image here, where the martyrs are part of the story, but so is the gentry. And that, I feel, is part of just the kind of the houses that he was working in, and the material that he was basing himself on. And so that kind of suffering from the sequestration, from the penalties, from the being put in prison, is now in this collection being made part of the actual narrative of the English Catholic community. And so he's really folding that into the bigger story. And so that is, he's also including in that those oaths and those petitions and everything that makes a case for Catholics being super loyal and being part of the English nation, and not the opponents of it, not the enemies of it. And so those petitions that I showed earlier, they're transcribed in this. And so thinking through that kind of collection as an access point through those family archives is really highlighting in those family archives just the power of the multivalence of it. So you've got a family, it's really tracing their own family. You've got sons writing on letters from previously, from their fathers, in order to make sense of it, in order to tell that family story. But it's here also used in order to tell the story of the English Catholic community, but then also of not the English Catholic community as opposed to and completely separate from the rest of the English story, but very much as part of it, and as a very loyal subject. And that is also through those connections with those antiquaries. You see that constant intertwining. And I think that's one of the power of those family archives is, in general, is just that multivalence and those it's hard to make sense of, because it's not an easy, just a linear story or an easy, this is how we're going to trace this. But precisely because it's that ambiguity and that pulling in all kinds of directions is perhaps more reflective of the sense of belonging that they are creating here. And on that note, I will end this.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisbeth. That was really interesting. I'm going to hand the floor over now to everybody else who's participating to see if you have any questions for our speakers, thoughts, comments, reflections on some of these themes in your own work. Interesting how much overlap there is in some sense between the issues that Katie and Lisbeth are identifying there. And I was nodding along while also thinking, oh no, I hadn't even thought of that one, which is never that reassuring. So yes, if you'd like to jump in, if you could either just unmute yourself and go ahead and speak, or drop your thought in the chat, that would be great. Thank you.
I can't see a hand yet. Can I ask a question? Yeah, because so I really, those multi-layers of the kind of why are people preserving stuff, and I really like as well the spatial element to that, because that's very much the case. In just I've got like the boxes of my grandfather, but I'm also curious because so the kind of the spatial, the emotional, the like professional curatorial, there are some specific reasons, or like professional reasons that are set down on paper. But is there also the kind of inherent to an archive? So thinking through, like, there's humans making those kind of decisions, but you've also got a sense of responsibility of, well, it's been passed down to generations. And so yes, people are trying to remove things or trying to silence things, but how much is there also the responsibility of, well, if we've inherited this, and which feels maybe like some internal logic to these kind of paperwork that is maybe not as I mean, in the way that I'm not as eloquent, but not as articulate in the way that professionals might articulate it. But there is still that kind of expectation of this needs to be passed on. Do you get a sense of that or not?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, certainly if you were looking at ordinary kind of family historians, I think a lot of, or the reason they engage with kind of family history projects, which is the kind of family historians I tend to like talk to, they have such a real strong sense that they have these ancestors, that they often don't know them, as in so they're actively trying to find them, and so that's kind of part of that genealogical process of them looking, and what they have in their archive passed down through generations are kind of little kind of fragments, and they're trying to build patchwork stories, which is just a very normal historian thing. That's what we all do, so that feels very familiar. What I think is kind of different is that we sympathize and they don't, and so there's a lot more relationship of the items that survive are play a much bigger role in their stories, and I think that's really quite interesting that they will literally take a photograph of that letter and put it in their family history. So they won't just kind of, my parents loved each other. It's like, here is a letter, this is the proof. So there's that kind of, I think, yeah, that sense that once you haven't curated it, but you have it and you don't have very much, and so therefore you kind of want to keep it because it's something that you're looking for as well as holding. I think with people like Gilbert on the really big ones, I think there's some, like, you have to accept that they have relationships with their parents, with their siblings, that the choices to keep certain types of letter are clearly, I think, informed by the kind of stories they want to remember about their families. And they're not, and so we often, I think that's a 19th century instinct, is the idea that they all curated it so they're all very respectable and polite. But the reason Gilbert Innes is such a fabulous archive is he has 31 illegitimate children and 30 mistresses, and we have all the letters. And so that's why you have all the fun. So this is not an archive that has had that kind of what's the word, like curation around respectability applied to it. And there are actual very practical reasons about that. It went into the hands of lawyers, and it was held in a lawyer's office for over 100 years, and so that's that part of that story. But I think there is that kind of sense that people keep the information for different kinds of reasons. So the lawyers kept that because he died with over £1 million in 19th century money, and so 60 odd children came out of the woodwork and made a claim on the estate, and so the lawyers had to work through all these claims, and they used this family archive to kind of do that. And so the records are then surviving because they're trying to legitimize or assess the legitimacy of all these claims around like who should get the money, and so that's a fun part of that story. But I think it also tells you about, like, well, why it's important to keep certain types of letter, like love letters by mistresses, and perhaps not to keep other types of letter which aren't pertinent to that. And so you've got all these kind of competing interests that are about, what do we want to remember about this person, but also what do we need to remember for legal reasons, and probably a million more on top of that.
Fantastic. I can see a hand there from Brodie. Brodie, would you like to jump in with thought, question?
Sure. So I think this is probably for both of you, and it's a kind of simplistic question, but I'm curious. I was thinking about, so this is a workshop about family archives. So the immediate question is, how are family archives different from other archives? And you've both gone a long way towards answering. I just wanted to sort of focus on one particular thing I was thinking about, which is, this is an overgeneralization, but I feel like family archives, the user and the archivist are the same person, in a sense. They're both keeping the thing and using it in a more sort of direct and constant way, perhaps. Whereas in an institutional archive, there's a sort of separation there. There's a sense that there is the archivist and there are the users, and they're not necessarily the same people. And often, you have outsiders coming in and using institutional archives. I just wondered if sort of thoughts from you two about what that means for the nature of a family archive, the fact that because they're so connected to the very person who's preserving it is also using it, what that means for how they end up being shaped, what they end up being used for, that sort of thing.
That's such a cool question. But it also makes me think, because the bit that so not my own research, or not my academic research, but the bit that I'm in my free time, if we've got that, I'm starting to get really interested in is like my own like family, right? So the boxes that I've got of my grandfather, essentially. And started to read a lot of like historians doing their own family research, and you've got that kind of intriguing. That's why we ask that question, right? Of the, okay, so the ones who are preserving this is also the ones who's really invested in this and using these kind of family archives. And so what does that mean? What does that connection mean? What does it mean to dive into that past? And what does that do to those connections across those generations? But I think, yes, with family archives and with family histories, that's where we make space for those kind of reflections, and that's where we acknowledge that, and both make space or feel like we have to acknowledge that. But I think in lots of other, I mean, in institutional archives are also the ones who still use it, right? So yes, there is maybe a professional person paid for to do that or given that specific task, but it is still they are still being paid by the institution. This is still an institution that has been maybe running for generations. And so thinking about like the early modern, like my nuns, like that's by a member of the community who is the one who's in charge of the archive. So how is that so very different from like a family person or a family member being really invested in preserving those records? And so that's what, thinking about what is a family archive and why do we have those questions more, makes it so intriguing, I think. But I think with lots of other archives, they are also bringing that past into the present. They are also people invested in maybe in slightly different ways, but I'm not sure that that line is as strict as we might think it could be.
I agree with that. And I think I would also add that sometimes people end up with family archives that aren't their own, but still feel an obligation to care for them. And that's really fascinating. And so a number of people who've been involved in our Inheriting the Family Network came along because for various reasons, a family's archive fell into their hands. Like one of them, they bought books online and then found a whole pile of photographs that all belonged to clearly the family that had owned the books in the first place, right? In another case, I had this is a member of public who came to an event, and she had all these photographs that had been a part of a photography studio in the 19th century, and they had the negatives. And so now she is trying to find the families of each of the negatives to give them back. And this is her kind of project, right? And so there's this kind of interesting obligation that certain types of records kind of create because they are identified as family records, and the sense that there is a family there who really cares about that negative and will be grateful that you bring it to them. It's an imagination of that person, but it's one that drives them in that kind of interesting mission around how to care for an object. And I kind of think you could kind of think of some archivists, perhaps especially the institutional ones, who have a very strong affective connection to their archives, and it might not be quite in the same familial lens, but certainly they understand it as a form of care and a care work, and sort of, you know, people who run into burning buildings to grab those papers, right, because they have this sense of the importance of history. So there's a whole lot of emotions probably going on in archives that are not dissimilar, and so what is the line between the family and the non-family archive is probably a lot blurrier anyway.
That's a great question, Brodie. I feel like I've thought a lot about the archive side of it, but actually thinking about how is it different to all of the other types throws up a completely different set of questions. I've also found 18th century people who inherit archives that aren't theirs, that then they kind of feel obliged to keep, which shows it's quite a long-standing feeling. We've got a comment here in the chat from Jill, who said she's interested about emotions behind the act of archiving being explored. And says that I think Jill, sounds like Jill's from an archiving background. She says, for many of us in archiving, it's a missing but essential consideration. I wondered, could you say a little bit more about emotions in the archive and thinking about how you kind of go about capturing those, or where you think you see them expressed? And maybe Jill, if you have anything you'd like to add to that, it'd be interesting to hear from an archivist on their take on that.
I've got an interesting piece that I've got the volume coming out called The Routledge History of Modern Emotions, and there's a lovely piece on archives, and I'm really struggling to remember the person who wrote its name, but they are lovely and it's a lovely chapter. But it was about Indian archives and the way that they are going mouldy and just kind of falling apart. And her whole piece is about affect in the archive and the way, the distress that it causes you to go in, and you're so hopeful as this historian who wants to create this story, right? And literally these papers are falling apart as you hold them, or you are not allowed access to them. And so there's this kind of strange irony of, like, the archive isn't looking after the papers, but they also don't want you to touch the papers because that will make it worse. And this is about chronic underfundings, and it's kind of about the conditions of those archives. But it's the way that we often think about, I think, emotions in the archives as being about our love and passion, or, you know, reading a love letter and crying, or all those kind of things, a relationship with our subjects that we form through the record. And I thought, like, it's a really interesting reflection on the way that actually the physical space of the archive, the condition of the records themselves, the implications for that all become part of your kind of effective relationship with what you do. And I guess maybe for professional archivists, maybe they do have more of those emotions and they maybe just don't think about it as much. I imagine it's quite distressing if you find one of your records has been badly damaged, for example, even if they don't maybe think about that as much.
I am unmuted. Okay. Because I love that, and I want to read that that essay, because that kind of the materiality of it is really interesting. With thinking of, like, the Catholic archives, Catholic records, they're really, like, describing very gruesome things. And so that kind of emotion of what are people doing to each other here, they are yeah, the description of that martyrdom, where it feels like they're trying to evoke, like, very strong emotion, but at the same time there's that kind of there's the redemptive element to it. And I think because, well, they are dying for the cause, and they will be saved, and they really get glossed with, well, it's not really in this collection, but in, like, Eastern family archives, they really get glossed in a kind of like some pride within that family, of okay, so this is our martyr, and we that's a good thing, which creates some kind of distance from, just because when I read these, I'm just, like, physically ill from what is happening to those bodies. But then in the kind of framework that they are placing it, they're creating a certain distance from it, or making those emotions of just revulsion, making sense of them, and thereby actually de-weaponizing them in a way, or weaponizing them for other purposes of that kind of that pride in their good fight for the right cause. But I'm intrigued in that kind of needing to recognize that, because I've never, when I went into doing this kind of research, nobody told me, oh yeah, by the way, there's a lot of blood there, and that I think now, at least people working on history of slavery are like warning their graduate students and telling each other no, this is emotionally hard to go through these kind of materials, because there's actual humans being reduced to just numbers. And I think that kind of, just that acknowledgement of doing this kind of work, doing that kind of work, and that we as historians don't need to necessarily, we as historians, we as archivists, we as anyone engaging with this, doesn't need to have that complete emotional distance, I think is really, useful because it is opening like lots of very interesting questions. But also I can also already see some of that distancing happen in the past. Sorry, that was very rambly. But that, yeah, emotions in the archives are really interesting.
We've got a question that's kind of connected, I think, to what you've just been discussing in the chat here, which is about emotional links to artifacts and do they water down to succeeding generations? And I guess that connects to what you was been saying about intergenerational memory, Katie. I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of how far we're able to trace effective responses as they sort of transmit.
I mean, it would make sense that they do, but also I think the moment that we meet an archive often is when the effect is high, right? And so for family historians, often like it'll be something that they found in a box of their mother's that they then value a lot. And so there's this kind of sense of which at one generation it might not have mattered very much, but because it's the thing that fills your gap in that history you're trying to create or that story you want to tell, then suddenly it comes to a new kind of meaning. And I think there's also that true that we think things that are old are important, right? And so, you know, yeah, you get that 18th century object and you're like, oh, I can't put that in the bin, but what do I do with it, right? And so I kind of think that age matters and I guess so things kind of maybe move in and out of importance for different generations, but also as they can make meaning out of those objects. And I think once they move into archives, in some ways you could say, well, they could be a bit lost because they sit on a shelf and might not be used for years. But on the other hand, there's a sort of prize, right? We at that point recognize they're an intangible heritage that should be insured for a lot of money, and we pay a lot of money to preserve them. And so we do kind of invest a lot of care in them, even if we're not using them in the same ways. So I don't think there's an easy story there of we just, you know, like things fall out of usage or out of love. I think there's a kind of a story about related values to the people who use them and to their value more generally as surviving objects.
There's a follow-up question here about whether you have any particularly memorable meetings with living descendants and how you've gone about approaching those meetings. Ellen Smith says she's working on letters of imperial families and has corresponded with living family members who've donated papers to archives. So I don't know if you have any. I have a meeting, in fact, my first one on Friday with a living descendant. So this is quite pertinent. I'd be curious what your experiences have been of dealing with that.
Oh, yeah, that'd be good. Okay. So yes, but in like an intriguing, in that way that I was saying, the kind of the layeredness of lots of this, like you've got yes, there's a family, which is the biological family, which is also not as linear as I just drew. But then that kind of the Catholic connection, and then them building themselves into that English story. Because so just working on English Catholics gets you talking to a lot of English Catholics as well. And there's a certain protectiveness around what you can and cannot necessarily say about this. And I mean, my very first conference paper, I made a mistake of going to the Catholic Record Society conference and saying, oh yeah, no, I'm not going to talk of them as exiles because they're not just victims, they are these mobile people. Don't do that. So there is a certain, I mean, protective sounds really bad, but like the bad connotation. There's a constant connection with when you're telling these kind of stories. You'll have a responsibility, and we know what we've built our community now on. So that's one element of that, but also there is again how different are family archives from other types of archives, or how broad is our understanding of family. Like lots of religious orders, that they are still there, right? And they are they're not the biological people for descendants, but they are the institutional descendants. And there's also that same well, we are the ones protecting these kind of records, so we also or protecting and preserving and ensuring that these stories don't get lost. But that also then has a responsibility to who you're allowing into this, because that lots of these the religious, they are still privately owned, they are not part of the public records. And so navigating that in the, I'm not out there to go and tell the Catholics are the enemies of the state in England, but I'm interested in what kind of stories are being told. So yes, because that's the bit of archives. There are people who will be responsible for them across the generations.
I think my stories are all much like sillier. Like Gilbert has many descendants because he had so many illegitimate children, and so every now and again I just get a letter from somebody telling me that they're a descendant, and I'm very curious about this. And I write back and like, oh yes, do you know anything? And they never do. They're just like, no, I just know that this is my my great grandfather. I mean, and I don't know how they know either. So like clearly they believe that, but how whether they did a genealogy, whether they have good records, or whether they're just making it up, I have no idea. But it's kind of curious that they feel a need just to tell you that they exist, and they don't really seem to want much more from you. And I've also had to deal with the clerks of Pennycook, the now generation, because the archive is private, and so you have to get permission if you're going to print. And that one of the more curious things about that was that one of the female ancestors is called Anna, and in every bit of paperwork we have that survives, she's called Anna. And he insisted that in my article I had to call her Anne because that was her name. And I'm like, I'm not sure it is her name, right? Like, I don't have any evidence that her name is Anne. I only have evidence that it's Anna. And so I think that he has that sense that Anne's a formal name and Anna's a nickname, but I'm not always sure that in the 18th century that holds. And so there's also those kind of curious sensibilities, and then my ethical obligations to, do I call her Anna because that's what her name is, or do I call her Anne because that's what the family would like me to do? And so they're kind of curious, but they're kind of trivial, I guess, in some ways.
I can see a hand up from Mike. Would you like to jump in with any thoughts on this?
Yeah, thanks. And actually, I think it ties in quite nicely with those last comments from both Elizabeth and Katie. It's a really interesting all round. I think that the thought ill-formed question, apologies, is about understanding archives, and particularly family archives, and the different tales that might be told from them and who's telling them. So, Elizabeth, you mentioned what stories are being told from these materials. Does this depend? How much does this depend upon who's doing the telling in that? So, who's creating the story from family archives and personal archives? We have different as a professional researcher, as an academic researcher, I have a different emotional connection. I do have an emotional connection with the family stories and sometimes the families that I'm working with. So there's a question there a bit about how we manage that, which Katie, some of those points that you just pulled out really nicely, but also then about how we collaborate, because we each benefit and get something different from that relationship where it's possible to collaborate with those family historians and owners of family archives as well. But the practicalities of doing that can be quite challenging, but also very rewarding. So sorry, it's a bit of a kind of around the mishmash of stuff, but I don't know. Really interesting questions that have been raised so far. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know that I have answers, but I do, like, it is interesting. So I invite people to what I call History Harvest, and we usually theme it photographs, objects, and people bring, and they're usually not very many. You maybe get like a dozen, and they come with their objects, and then and we give some small presentations. I usually do have a couple of people so that it's not boring, but we kind of, like today, they get 10 or 15-minute presentations that kind of talk through the way that historians think about these objects or what they could do with them as family historians to help them learn. So it's my added value that I'm giving them, the historians' insight. And then we just sit in groups and we chat about their objects. And it is really fascinating. One, because you get to see what's out there, but also these are very personal, very kind of emotional stories. They're not professional stories at all. And so it's an opportunity really for people to share stories about being family historians, about why they have these things, how they got them. And at some kind of a level, like, I'm really interested about it. And so I keep doing it. my history hack was, what do I do with this, right? Like, if is this data collection? Is this data collection of, is this, do I need to be a sociologist here and think about this as that sort of ethnography? Or is this to help me understand how I think about objects better? What am I doing with it? And so sometimes I kind of come out and go, I learned a lot there. I'm not sure what I'm meant to do with it as a historian, other than just have a better sense of humans as human beings, which is always good. But yeah, so sorry, that's not really an answer to your question, but it's just the kind of thought that occurred to me after.
I don't know if this connects to your experience, Katie, but the only time I have tried to connect with somebody about kind of their own archive that was held privately, and I sort of asked them, like, do they keep anything themselves, knowing that when they kind of die, they will be the, and they were very like, it's amazing how resistant people are to the questions you want them to give you. He was like, no, it wouldn't be interesting if it was my stuff because it's not old, and he was having none of it at all, which I found very interesting. He didn't want to be thought of as the next kind of person in the line in that way, but perhaps I asked him the wrong question. I wanted him to tell me what I wanted to hear, not what he wanted to talk about. We've got one last question here, and then I think we should let Lisbeth and Katie go, because they'd be more than generous with their time, which is from Amanda. And I think it's a question that probably connects to stuff we may be discussing in some of the later workshops about the transition of family archives into institutions. And she asks, is there a disconnect between the huge sentimental value attached to family archives by families and the process of appraisal that's carried out by the institution to which they've been donated, which I guess connects to what Jill was asking as well, about how far do emotions travel into institutions or not when they get catalogued and so on.
So I used to work in a museum, and a lot of members of the public used to come and try to give you their family archives, and those were difficult conversations, because a lot of it was things that were, well, actually felt like war medals, right? Everybody wanted to give you their great grandfather's war medals because they didn't really want to keep them anymore, but they thought they were important and they wanted to give them to you. But like, literally, we were a military archive. We had hundreds of war medals, so unless it was like a Victoria Cross or something very rare, we did not need any more examples of a war medal from World War I that was a standard service. And so then you're having to say, no, look, sorry, this isn't interesting to us. We have many examples of this, and so that's a really challenging conversation as well, because they clearly value it. But also they want to hand it over. So it's kind of like they want to recognize its importance, but not keep ownership of it. And I think that's there's an interesting kind of thing going on with their emotions around those objects. And in some cases, my boss, I didn't do this, he things for people. So he would say to them, well, look, what you could just do is you could just leave these with us, and if we decide we'd like them, we'll keep them, but we might just decide that it's not worth keeping and we'll put them in the bin, and you have to sign this form to say that you're happy with that. And a lot of people were willing to do that, and it made me think that a lot of people needed somebody else to do the emotional work of putting something in the bin. For them, and for whatever reason my boss decided that he was prepared to do that for them. And I know some archivists and people think that's very unethical. They should have been forced to go home and bin it themselves, but I kind of thought there was a really interesting kind of negotiation there of a service that we were providing around giving you permission to put something in the bin. And so there's a kind of so there is that sense that what the archival appraisal does can be much colder, but sometimes it can be a thing that perhaps you need to happen so that you can also let go. And so that, again, that relationship's kind of interesting and messy.
Yeah, tying in with that as well, and not at all about what my disciplinary expertise is on, but like my grandfather's papers, because so that kind of, yes, giving someone permission to throw something away is one thing, but at the same time there is also the kind of putting something into an official archive is like putting it into the story and giving it a certain veneer of respectability and of like relevance, and this is also other people who may find this useful, or this is the story of more than just my family. And so, because I'm just thinking in the bit that has been intriguing me about my grandfather kept archive of an organization that I do not want to be associated with, but he kept those archives, and he kept his own family archives, and the family archives are under my bed in my parents' house. The organizational archives they used to be in his house, and he used to constantly work on those. And I mean, he worked in tandem on both of those archives, but they have been deposited in Leuven University Library with an official parade and an official kind of transition to that. And it was the kind of, okay, so now this is part of the public record. These are no longer these archives that this grandfather has been keeping on his own, and being interested in pulling things together and culling and data gathering within that. It now is this official part of the official story. But it's so like the emotion. So I went through the boxes under my bed, and just the emotion of archiving that is in that, and in preserving because he lost a baby daughter, preserving all the letters around her. He wrote like about his wife in like really beautiful ways that I had never seen him be so emotional, but like putting that down on paper, which does make me think differently about the archive that is in Leuven University Library, because for him, that kind of collecting was super emotional, and that was how he was making sense of things. But also that transition was super emotional because it made it more than just his own archive of that in one organization. So that's not an answer to this. This is just me thinking through what's going on in those archives. But also just that there is a certain emotion, and the way that you were describing, and the emotion of being allowed to throw something away, just that kind of the veneer of an institution is doing something more than just officialdom as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lisbeth and Katie. That's been so interesting. I can see we still have more questions filtering in, but in the interest of allowing Katie, who's in Australia, to have some dinner and go to bed, I think we should hold fire for now. So I think some of these will be questions we'll be returning to, especially unwanted objects. I know that Jill, who's speaking at the next workshop on the 20th of July, which is up on the website if you'd like to come along to that, has done quite a lot of work with objects that end up in charity shops and families that give their kind of inherited items over in that way in a non-institutional setting. So that might be of interest. It's also made me think we should get some archivists to come and talk about behind the veil and what processes do happen there when they inherit stuff. So I'll look into doing that and see if we can have a session on that too. In the meantime, it just remains to thank Lisbeth and Katie so much for their time and their presentations. That's been, I for one, have found it fascinating. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting and for the really interesting conversations.
It's our pleasure. Thank you.